Welcome to Field Notes for Pastors, a conversational podcast for pastors and others in ministry as we explore our soul-deep work in the fields of the Lord. Whether you're in a ministry season of fullness or famine, we want to explore themes around Paul's words in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 6. I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God has been making it grow. In today's episode, I'm so thankful to welcome Greg Marshall as we explore the topic of metaphors for ministry and the stories that we live by. Greg Marshall is chief storyteller and producer at CI Design. He assists organizations in creating powerful stories and experiences that create traction and momentum with their audiences and teams. Greg has won national and international awards for his writing and producing, including 3 Emmy wins and several Emmy nominations. Greg has led alignment, story, and brand workshops with nearly 200 organizations and has been a featured keynote speaker on topics related to creativity, purpose, and storytelling. His background includes working as a therapist for children who have autism, starting a publishing company, being a full-time hip-hop artist, consulting schools in areas of inclusion and classroom culture, co-founding a music mentorship nonprofit, and being active in local nonprofits and his church. Greg also holds a master's degree from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and outside of work, Greg and his wife Laura have 4 amazing daughters. I'm so thankful to have Greg join us today. He's been a great theological conversation partner for me. He's been a creative force in my own life and is someone I consider a friend. So welcome to the podcast, Greg.
Man, I'm super excited to talk to you about this. I love your book concept and what you do. So yeah, I'm excited to talk.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so I've shared this intro, but maybe you could give us a little background on what you're up to now, and perhaps just also a little background on your life in ministry.
Yeah, I like you said, my wife and I, Laura and I, have 4 daughters who are very active, and so I am definitely overextended in everything related to that and life. My work as chief storyteller at CI Design, helping organizations to find real alignment so they can stop wasting money on branding and marketing and culture work that doesn't work. And I'm also a storyteller in an entertainment sense. I have a podcast and a one-man show that I have developed and am performing. And it's all for me, it's all tied together and it's all related to ministry. It is all my ministry, but I have a master's degree in Christian studies from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. I started an MDiv program, but dropped out to pursue music. And then eventually finished the program that I did over the course of time. And I realized that I always wanted to be deeply involved in the local church, but I had a sense that it would be healthier for me to lead under somebody's leadership as opposed to be the main person. And a little bit of a long story attached to that, but the short version is I knew I wanted to be deeply involved in ministry in the church context, but I was seeing a lot of my peers in the seminary context to be a little too wrapped up in the prestige of trying to be a big time pastor and be, kind of the celebrity Christian vibe. And I just felt like I was maybe vulnerable to wanting to be too important like that. And so I backed away from the pursuit of ministry in the traditional sense and went towards music, which led to business and helping organizations. But yeah, my role in the local church is very central to my life. Mm-hmm. Usually I help on the teaching team now with, Eastbrook Church, which is awesome, but I've been doing that at a variety of places for a long time.
Yeah, that's super helpful, Greg. I think just to get a lens for people who may not know you, I know you, but into that, how you view what you do and how the ministry life and world comes together. There are some strands there that you mentioned I'd love to maybe come back to, but I want to start just around the concept of what you do with CI Design. I love your title, Chief Storyteller. Talk a little bit about what that means and why you think story is so important, not only for the organizations you might be working with, but also how that might connect into the work we do in ministry or with the local church. Give us some insights about why is storytelling so central for you?
Yeah, it's tricky because it's not storytelling in the sense of I just share stories about an organization. As a
Mm-hmm.
chief storyteller, the reason that title is meaningful to me is story frames entire ecosystems.
Mm.
And so a story or a metaphor gives meaning to an entire organization and helps them frame what they're measuring and how they're behaving. It speaks to all the things. So when a company, a person, a family, when a group of people understand what story they're a part of,
Mm-hmm.
then they can behave and function in a way that reflects and honors that story, which makes all the other things easier. Like in an organization, it could be operations, branding, marketing, hiring, developing people, whatever it is. And so I, as a chief storyteller, I help leadership teams find alignment so that they can stop sort of wasting time and money on stuff that isn't working and they can't see why.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times I'll go into a leadership team conversation with an organization and they'll use words like innovation, customer focused, excellence. But you dig deeper and you realize that everyone on that leadership team is actually imagining different pictures behind those words. The CEO or the executive director means one thing, and the CMO, chief marketing officer or development director, means something else. And then you have like a sales component where people are thinking about it differently in a whole other way. And then they launch campaigns and try to accomplish initiatives, but it doesn't stick. So I lead a workshop process that helps teams find that framework that gives meaning to what they're doing so that they can have conversations and collaboration that's more aligned and more connected than they've ever experienced before.
Mm-hmm. And how do you think that connects with the work of ministry? I mean, I can make some extrapolations in my head, but how does that connect when you think about being a pastor in a local church, or maybe somebody's listening and they serve in a parachurch ministry or something like that? How does it connect?
Well, so many beautiful ways. One of my favorite quotes, and I'll probably get it wrong, by C.S. Lewis is, all truth, all but a few fragments, is won by metaphor. So a pastor preaching to a congregation, anxious to communicate all of his or her points to the audience, really excited about the 5 points and the information that they want to share. What the pastor often doesn't realize is that abstract explanation of insights to them is so much more meaningful because there's a frame that they're attaching it to that they're not aware of. And so in order to actually communicate those points, that information to an audience in a way that produces real meaning and connection, it's important to recognize that the humans that are receiving it, they're not going to receive the same meaning unless you first establish the frame that makes it mean something. Which is why, you go to seminary and they're like, start with a story, a metaphor, start with a thing. But what's missed is like the point that's made, and then they often change the subject and just share information. So the use of metaphor can frame a sermon in a way that aligns you with human nature and enables you to communicate better. But that's just scratching the surface. There's also how a pastor understands his role in that church, like what your book is speaking to, but also metaphor in this kind of framework is necessary to create an organization that is aligned and not spinning its wheels in ice all the time because we're trying to explain things and create a strategy, for example. Let's all get in a room and put a bunch of words on large Post-its on the wall, and then somebody take notes and summarize it. And look, we have our thing, and everyone looks at it and nods, but there's never been a frame. There's never been a picture. And so it's just abstract language, and it's another strategy that actually has no authority. So I could say that about every part of the ecosystem of an organization. If there is no frame, there is literally no shared meaning. And so what happens is the dominant culture or the governing norms of thought and behavior that are already dominant and present, they always win. So any new language, any new vision, any new desire to grow in a particular way, it loses because the concrete always wins. And if you don't have a concrete frame for disrupting what you're doing, the abstract falls apart. So it's pervasively related.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The last comment, like I was listening to Ian McGilchrist on the Justin Brierley's podcast, Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and he was talking about, like, we don't understand anything without metaphor, like, period.
Yep.
So it plays a massive role.
Yeah, you and I were in a meeting yesterday where you referenced that same thing in a different kind of context, that our understanding of reality is metaphorical. Like we don't think of it that way, but we're basically putting things together in these pictures that help us understand the everyday reality we live in. And I'll put actually in the show notes a reference to that episode where Justin Brierley talks with Ian McGilchrist and some of the writings that McGilchrist has, which are so great on these kind of topics. You and I have talked a lot about that, about metaphors, images for the work of ministry. And so you hinted at it. You talked just a little bit, and obviously I'm spending a lot of time thinking about how, as a pastor, the way that we think of ourselves in ministry, like that framing metaphor, is so powerful for then the way that we do the work. And I guess, what do you think are some of the prevailing kind of metaphors that people may just accept in ministry that they may not even realize that they're doing, that are maybe short-circuiting the work of ministry? I didn't ask you this ahead of time, but when you think about, I think the dominant image people might think of pastors is shepherd, right? But there's a lot of other metaphors that people may be operating in this day and time in our culture. Is there anything that pops out to you in your imagination when you think about kind of the ways that we frame the work of ministry as a metaphor?
Yeah. And, remember, metaphor, it's another way of saying there's something concrete that we're attaching to.
Mm-hmm.
And what I see, and I saw this, when I was starting seminary, the most powerful concrete metaphor that a lot of pastors attach to is whichever popular pastor they grew up idolizing.
Mm-hmm.
And that person becomes a concrete framework for what it means to be successful. But what's really tricky is they're only able to explore that metaphor and attach to it based on their understanding of it. So they see, wow, people are wowed by them. They love their speaking. They're always in front of a group. They have more and more people come. People admire them, but they don't see whether or not that person is who they are behind the scenes. They don't see the tendencies that rise up when you try to hold up that performance. So it's a metaphor that quickly falls apart. But I honestly think it is probably the most pervasive. I don't even think, and I think people like use the language of shepherd, but haven't actually immersed themselves in that metaphor to truly embody it. And so when people use the word shepherd, I think they're ultimately attaching it to whatever impressive pastor that they attach to, which could be a really healthy person. And maybe that person was really embodying the metaphor of a shepherd. But I feel like there's two layers of disconnect there, like not knowing the metaphor actually, but just assuming that this person attaches to it. But yes, like everybody has something that they're making, that a framework that allows them to make sense of and make meaning of the role that they have. And I think it's celebrity. I think it's whatever pastor, apart from pastor. But yeah, I think the primary metaphors have been more inherited from pop culture or that person's history than scripture or the classics.
Yeah. My book, and we've talked about this as well, The Pastor as Gardener, is basically a metaphorical approach to the pastoral role and calling and identity and work, all through these agrarian images. And I know that you've done some work with gardening images and metaphors. Why do you think that imagery is so powerful for people right now in our culture, but also particularly for the work of the church.
Yeah, it's a very powerful metaphor. There's valuable overlap. If somebody's like, well, no, it's a shepherd. Well, Christ uses plenty of agrarian metaphors. Number one, I would just, before even talking about that specific metaphor, just considering the fact that Jesus entered into the world at a point where 10-year-olds had most of the Torah memorized. And so he rarely quoted scripture. He used metaphors. Why? Because the metaphor would establish a new filing cabinet. That would then, when people would go back to scripture, they would have a new frame for thinking about this words that they were so familiar with. And I think that your choice of the gardening metaphor is especially potent because when pastors, leaders allow themselves to actually enter into it, they're going to find that the metaphor serves them in shouldering the burden of understanding and communicating what they're trying to accomplish. A metaphor like gardening automatically, I don't know all the ways that you use the metaphor to frame, but intuitively, soil speaks to the context in which life is expected to grow. So what makes up soil? Don't even think about church, but what makes soil fertile? What makes soil good? What kills soil? You just talking about that will raise up words and categories that then you can move over. Like, what about the context that we're creating, the culture that we're creating that's supposed to support growth? How does that metaphor speak to that? The plants and fruits that we're trying to grow. What are the characteristics of them that speak to what we're trying to grow? The needs that growth has, like water and sunlight, or fertilizer. Well, what kind of fertilizer are we going to use? Because some of it has toxic impact in the long run. Are we trying to speed up growth in a way that leads to toxicity? Like, oh my gosh, we came into a core question inside of the metaphor before we had a chance to everybody start debating about it. The metaphor enables you to get into meaningful things before everybody's, reactions come up. Weeds. Well, what are the weeds how do you deal with weeds in a garden? How are we dealing with weeds? Do we have an agreement on what those weeds are? So the metaphor very quickly creates categories that can guide strategy and alignment. It organizes the conversation in a way that helps to shoulder the burden of actual collaboration and work. So I think it's a holistic metaphor. I think it allows pastors to go into very intimate parts of the ministry. You could talk about every part of your ministry inside of that metaphor. And the whole time, whoever you're talking to, you can have confidence that you're imagining the same thing and you're actually talking about the thing because you're tethered to something concrete in order to have the conversation.
I love that. I mean, just all of the discussion around, the concreteness of it. I think it helps us to move away from abstraction, but enter into the realities that we're facing, we're engaging with in ministry through some tangible terms that I think we all can make sense of. One of the things I think that's a challenge sometimes with the shepherding metaphor for us today is most of us don't relate to it. It's not something most of us are experiencing. Even if we've grown up in maybe more rural settings, we might have observed something, but it's not the same sort of sense of meaning. So we can read a book like A Shepherd's Take on Psalm 23. It's Keller's book in the old days. It's a good entry into that, but it's not necessarily something we live with in the same way as maybe a garden. A lot of people will have a garden, or at least they're taking care of a plant in our house. Have you found in your work with organizations that there are times where certain metaphors just aren't as powerful anymore because of that disconnection? Or maybe an organization is operating under a metaphor that has become not as meaningful for them anymore, or they need to kind of refresh their imagination with it, or they've had different understandings of it. How have you seen metaphors maybe lose their power in some ways?
Yeah, the number one reason that metaphors lose their power is because we exist in a very left brain hemisphere dominant culture that resists trusting it. Organizations change the subject, even if they do have a frame just kind of change the subject. Like, okay, we have that. Now who's going to write the website? Who's going to create a video? Who's going to plan for this event? And nobody's looking back to the metaphor to say, how does this serve and organize the content on the website? How does this inspire experiences for that event? How does this guide me in this class that I'm creating? And we just start pulling things out of the sky again. So we go back to abstraction. And so people say like, well, it's not really relevant to us anymore. Like, well, you never actually gave it authority. That's when metaphors lose their power. And so a lot of times, if I see an organization, most organizations, we live in an extremely left hemisphere, left brain dominant culture, which is a whole other conversation as to what that actually, it's a way of attending to the world. But it's all about manipulating. It's all about apprehending. It's not trying to comprehend the big picture. So we gravitate to this place of just get it done, just get it done. And when we function in that very left hemisphere dominant way, we end up sort of in a hall of mirrors, not, being detached from reality, but not knowing it and thinking that we're getting it just right. So metaphors die when people don't trust them and don't give them authority and don't take the time to let the metaphor pick you up and move you into the places where you can be most effective. But yeah, I've seen that again and again. And part of it, choosing the right metaphor as a facilitator of the process, it's fascinating. I find the most meaningful metaphor may not be the best one, but it's the one that the group can agree is something they can move forward with. And it's especially good if the metaphor I bring to the conversation dies in front of everybody. It's fascinating. Like when the authority brings a metaphor that's killed by everybody, then something rises up that everybody believes in. There's a resurrection of an idea that people are like, I can believe in that. I can actually understand this because I participated in the birthing of this thing. And I'll see it sometimes. I'll be like, that's not the best one for you guys. But the fact that you're all willing to actually work with it means it's going to be better than if you had the best one that nobody actually gave authority to.
When you're doing that kind of work, not asking you to reveal your trade secrets, but when you are sitting with a group, or say that you were sitting with a church, I know you've done this with churches and nonprofits, and you're trying to help people enter into their story. Sometimes we're so close to it that we can't see it anymore. We don't have fresh eyes. If you're trying to help them enter into their story, see the contours of the story, begin to identify what could be a central metaphor for the life of a church, or coming back into it and sharpening that up. How do you go about that? Because I think there may be pastors or ministry leaders sitting here who on the one hand are saying, okay, that sounds really interesting, but how would I go about this? And certainly they could reach out to you and hire you to do their work with them. But what might be a few ways that people could kind of intuit their way towards knowing a controlling or key metaphor for their organization or church?
Yeah, I guess there's two parts, three things on that. One, the way I do it is I do research to try to understand how are they intuitively framing themselves. And usually there's multiple frames that are contradicting each other or hindering each other. You can see it on a website, you can see it on social media, you can hear it in how they communicate. And then I'll research the competitors or the people who are that they admire or that they're in proximity to, and try to understand how they're framing themselves. Then I come in and I facilitate a conversation. I ask questions because people get anxious when you start with metaphor for real. Like they need to feel like you're listening to their words. And so I ask a bunch of questions. I do learn some good stuff. And then I have everybody literally draw pictures. So I'll put white, clean pieces of paper, colored pencils. I'll put crayons out sometimes to help adults not take themselves so seriously. And I'll ask everybody to draw a picture of a metaphor that communicates what we're ultimately trying to accomplish. We draw those metaphors, put them on the wall. Everybody can notice that everybody's got a different picture. For the most part, sometimes there's some overlap, but for the most part, people are not imagining the same thing when they think about what we're trying to accomplish together. And then we debate and whittle it down to like, what's the one metaphor that gives us the most fruitful starting place? The garden, for example. That's a rich metaphor. So now we can utilize that. So there's that process for the organization. Like, what are we trying to accomplish? But I think the gardening metaphor serves pastors and leaders really well. Start there. Start imagining what are you trying to accomplish in that space? And then from that place you can help facilitate a birthing of the metaphor. But kind of like put your oxygen mask on first, like on the plane, before you help somebody else. Align your own soul with what you're doing inside of the gardening metaphor, and you might find that metaphor actually grows one naturally that communicates to what you're trying to accomplish, or at least it puts you into a healthier alignment with yourself, with your team, and with God that allows you to then facilitate or participate in the facilitation of alignment as an organization to move forward.
Yeah, I love the creativity of the first part, just bringing us back to a little bit more creative aspect of things to draw out what we think that is, and then to enter into that and to have dialogue around those things. Such a good thing.
Yeah. It's fascinating too to see when people are drawing metaphor, like half the room is really excited, half the room feels like they're dying. Because they've like so many people have come up in our very Western culture, post enlightenment that basically redefined humans as brains on sticks. We were robbed of how meaning was actually communicated, and so it's all connected to the mental health crisis. It's all connected to addiction, suicide, mass killings. Like all of these symptoms we're seeing can be traced back to a disconnect, a separateness from meaning. But that curing that separateness within ourselves can be painful for people who have become successful being convinced that they're always right, always manipulating facts to get to a place of power. And I'm like, hey, let's slow down and let's actually communicate about what we're doing. But to some people, it feels like this is just some fluffy exercise. Like, no. I'm learning more about you right now than you could ever communicate to me with your edited words. I'm receiving unedited insights into how you actually see the world, how you don't see the world, and how you see your team. But you can't tell somebody to that because they need to be the expert in the thing. And so it's like I'll listen, and then you get the metaphors going, and then they have to discover, oh, that's how I see things. But it can take a couple of workshops and a fair amount of suffering before somebody realizes that they're now experiencing actual communication, because it doesn't stay in the right brain. The right brain invites the left to participate. It's just the right hemisphere actually questions itself and wonders. And when you have that filing cabinet created, it tells the left hemisphere, hey, let's attach everything to this frame. But if you don't start there, you got 100 different frames, just abstract, thrown all over the place. But the left brain never invites the right to help. So anyways, it's a fascinating process to see people who know to their core that they're right about something, and then over time realizing, oh, there's a light bulb that goes on that metaphor facilitates, but it requires a little bit of suffering.
Yeah, I think anything good requires a little bit of suffering. And I think when you're talking about this, as I ponder what you're saying, I know you are an incredibly creative person. I could hear somebody saying, oh, Greg, that works for you. You're creative. I'm more like I'm a logical thinker. Again, I'm not saying those are actually real categories, but you've talked about this. And I'm hearing some of Ian McGilchrist, the master and his emissary, within some of what you're saying. How has that activation of the right brain, which has been part of your life for a long, long time, but how has that really opened doorways for you in your own approach to your life, to your faith, to the work that you're doing? How have you cultivated that? How would you encourage someone even here listening to cultivate that themselves?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. I think one of the biggest blessings or fruits that's come out of contemplating and practicing this is curiosity. And there's times where I've been the most valuable person in the room in very practical ways simply because I'm the best at asking questions. And that means that my right hemisphere is engaged and involved because I'm not making all kinds of assumptions based on what people have said right away. And I'll see experts in a room, quote unquote experts. Somebody will explain something and they're just nodding and being like, I know exactly what you're going through and I know exactly how to fix it. Like, hold on, dude. You have not asked any questions, or you've only asked 2 questions. You have not been surprised by what you don't know yet. Therefore, you can't offer anything. So the practicing of this, it's not I'm just talking about returning to how humans are designed to function. So when we practice that, it puts us in a place of more curiosity, more humility, more self-suspicion, more willingness to be disrupted. And therefore, we end up being more practically valuable in the room. We say obvious things that feel profound to people because we're just pointing out the thing that's actually real. The right hemisphere relates to reality. The left hemisphere just manipulates things to get something done. So practicing it has really been fruitful. And I would say from what to do, how to practice it, spend time with Jesus is the most powerful. And I would say that to a Christian or a non-Christian who wants to understand the neuroscience and practice of reorienting ourselves to a right brain leading way of functioning. 2 reasons. 1, Jesus is the Word made flesh. In other words, abstraction became concrete in Christ. That's the whole story. It started with the Word that was Christ. There was a concreteness, a oneness. Creation happens, the fall happens, everything is shattered, and we have this abstract explanation of here's what's going on. But in God's wisdom, aligning the story with human nature, Christ becomes man, the concrete metaphor that is true, that is living. And then you have not just that story, but then you have how he functions and teaches. So reading the Gospels, knowing that you are interacting with the metaphor, the myth, the mythos that's actually true.
Yes.
And then so you're already doing it. You're already practicing it just by interacting with him. But then it's when you observe how he communicates and you start studying the way that he moves, now you're watching the living metaphor, the living truth, life, and way. Practice it in front of you. So yeah, I think the more time, and then the sacraments like communion, baptism, prayer, these things that create encounters where heaven and earth come together and there's paradox. In those sacramental practices is where we really also practice the right brain, left brain, because we're imagining what's there. Like we're imagining Christ being present in communion, for example, and it's a piece of bread, So there's like these sacraments create these paradoxes that exercise and expand our imagination.
That's beautiful. Spend time with Jesus.
Yeah.
The Word made
For
flesh.
anybody, like I said, and I like back to the work stuff. I get to talk more about Jesus today, this last couple of years in my work with all kinds of people, atheists, a lot of Jewish clients and friends, Muslim, agnostic, you name it. And like these conversations are wide open, especially when there's a connection to the actual value and understanding of the neuroscience that's present in the stories.
There's just a richness to what you're saying here, Greg, that I just want to encourage anybody who's listening to just to dwell with that a little bit. I mean, the incarnational theology that's shaping your approach to story, to metaphor, and then kind of where you ended there, just about encounter with God. And I wonder if I can ask you a follow-up question. Again, this wasn't in some of the questions I sent you ahead of time, just coming to me right now. Can you open up, if you're willing to, with people about what prayer means to you and what it looks like.
Yeah, I can say two things. One, um, prayer has become my primary function in life.
Hmm.
It is the heartbeat of everything. And that really came out of a very challenging season where I was desperate for closeness because I felt all kinds of stress and trouble and different things that were happening. And I was tired of trying to spin up prayers from whatever I was feeling because it wasn't rooted in anything concrete. It was just floating around to whatever anxieties I had. And so I returned to my Catholic roots in this practice of the Lord's Prayer, which obviously we pray in the non-denominational context as well. It's all throughout the Christian faith. But as a kid, I had to memorize it, and I just was told to do it. And I came back to it, and as I was practicing, each line of the Lord's Prayer became an anchor, a framework. The whole thing became a framework, but then each line became a framework. And I could just say the whole thing straight through, and it would untangle me from whatever it was. But then I could let each line be a framework that almost like a doorway into a whole thing, and I could flow my feelings and thoughts and prayers. But I knew I was attached to that one thing, and then I'd leave that room and go in the next room of the next line. And so the Lord's Prayer really became a framework that guided me in my prayer. But then another thing that happened, I was listening to a guy, and I wish I could remember his name, but forgive me, whoever said this, and I'm not giving you credit. So a pastor, speaker, he wasn't a pastor. I think he worked with like the CIA or something. But he talked about how important it is to learn how to ask the question, not why is this happening, God? But a better question is, what do you want me to know about this? And just that, learning how to ask in a hard thing or in a beautiful thing, in a celebration or in a grieving or in an anxiety or stress. What do you want me to know about this? In conflict at work or on a board or in a team, what do you want me to know about this? It's a way of saying, I'm going to take this out of the hands of the left hemisphere that wants to just manipulate things and apprehend the situation. I'm going to take it out of the left's hands and let the right hemisphere participate first by saying, okay, I'm guessing that I don't know reality fully right now. So what do you want me to know about this? And in some of the more intimate moments with God, that is when I have heard most clearly what God has had to say. And it's like an opening of your mind and letting thoughts flow. And occasionally there's just something that sparks. And it's like, wait, that came out of nowhere. That feels wise. I'm going to take that to a trusted, wise friend or mentor. I'm going to take that to scripture. What do you think about this? What I feel like was a word from God that was mixed into my flow of thoughts as I asked this question. And I've witnessed where people are just like, whoa, that's exactly that's the phrase I was thinking while you were sharing your situation. Like that has happened in the last year twice in a way that has increased my faith exponentially. It's Lord's Prayer and what do you want me to know about this? Both related to the conversation we're having.
Again, just such depth there. I just love hearing you talk about it. So thanks for letting me ask that question. And the Lord's Prayer, I think for many of us is so profound, but I love the way you describe it as entering into a room with each phrase or statement, as well as kind of the big framework or the story of the Lord's Prayer being shaping. It reminds me of C.S. Lewis in his book, Letters to Malcolm. He talks about, it's kind of old-fashioned language, but he talks about festooning each phrase, like adding his own kind of territory or his own comments around each phrase. I used to talk about it as like each phrase becomes a diving board to jump into the pool of prayer, and then you get out and dive off the next one. And there, but I love that room, just kind of sitting in the room with God of each phrase of that. It's beautiful. And the questions, asking better questions is one of the themes, I think, within our conversation today, as you've talked even about your work and how it translates into prayer.
Yeah, I agree. And then what I love about that with the Lord's Prayer is there's two rooms before you can get to the provision part of the
Hmm.
conversation. And so you're just spending time with who God is, and then you're spending time with what God is doing in his kingdom, like the ministry of Jesus, before you can even get to the anxieties of provision. And then at the very end, it's the evil, deliver us from evil. So you're like intimacy with God, recognizing what God is doing, confessing your sins before you get to the things that are typically, like the most anxiety provoking. It slows us down, or organizes us, orients us in the same way that the gardening metaphor will, when a pastor just actually trusts the metaphor to orient them to their work. Each part of the metaphor is a room you can go in and sit in, and you'll come out of that having not talked about the thing that gave you anxiety, but you have more wisdom for how to deal with the thing that gave you anxiety. So it's a beautiful aligning, organizing process.
I'm grateful, Greg. I'm grateful for the time to talk today, the conversation we're having. I'm grateful for your friendship. If anybody else wants to kind of follow up, catch up with you and what you're doing, what are the best ways for people to hear what you're talking about, catch up with you, follow what you're up to?
Yeah, two best would probably be just look up Greg Marshall on LinkedIn. I'm the primary role chief storyteller at CI Design, and you'll see the other things related to the podcast and whatnot. But and then on Instagram, Figure Greg 80, FIGUREGREG, and then the number 80 on Instagram is where I share stuff related to the storytelling. The podcast is called Short Stories for a Better Day. Those are great places, and feel free, anybody, to reach out to talk about this stuff.
Wonderful. I'll make sure to put all that in the show notes as well so people can find those links easily. Again, just super thankful for you, thankful for this conversation today.
Yeah, and lastly, let me just close with this to say, I know you well enough to know that this book is coming from a place of knowing and practice, and you are certainly one of the healthiest, most grounded. I trust you, and I trust what you're writing, and I hope the people that are hearing this and that pick up the book understand that it's not just a bunch of words that somebody threw together. This is coming from a fertile soil, the thing that's grown, the book that is grown. So I'm excited to read it in depth, and I'm excited for people to inherit some of that health and wisdom that you've cultivated through a lot of hard work.
Thank you, Greg. It means a lot to me coming for you. So thank you for that. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Field Notes for Pastors. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with a friend. Give us a like or subscribe to this podcast on platforms where you listen. This podcast is linked with my forthcoming book, The Pastor as Gardener, a renewed vision for ministry, set to be released by Erdman's Publishing on March 24th, 2026. You can pre-order the book anywhere good books are found. And if you do pre-order the book, I have put together some resources as a gift to you. Find out how to access those pre-order resources via my website, mwerickson.com. Until next time, may you experience God's grace wherever God has planted you.